Home is supposed to be the safest place in the world. The people closest to you, the ones who know your name, your routine, your face, are supposed to be the people you trust most. And when something terrible happens, when someone you love goes missing or turns up gone, the people standing beside you at the funeral, the people wiping their eyes and squeezing your hand, are supposed to be grieving too. But sometimes they are not. Sometimes the person standing closest to the coffin is the reason the coffin exists. Sometimes the one handing out leaflets in the search party already knows there is nothing left to find. Sometimes the killer is right there in the front row, watching the family fall apart, knowing every answer to every question that is tearing them to pieces. Today we are covering 10 cases from the United Kingdom where the person responsible for taking a life inserted themselves directly into the grief they created. And in several cases, nobody noticed for years. Section 1. Colin Ash-Smith and the murder of Claire Tiltman. Claire Tiltman was 16 years old. She had just celebrated her birthday 4 days earlier. On the evening of January 18th, 1993, she left her home in Woodward Terrace, Stone, in the county of Kent, to walk to a friend's house nearby. She was studying for her GCSEs at Dartford Grammar School for Girls. She had dreams of becoming a firefighter. She was working toward her Bronze Duke of Edinburgh Award at Dartford Fire Station. She never made it to her friend's house. Claire took a short detour down London Road in Greenhithe. At some point in that short walk, a man attacked her from behind in a dark alleyway. She was harmed 9 times. Despite fighting back, Claire collapsed on the pavement in front of passing cars. People tried to help her. It was too late. She passed away that night. Her parents, Cliff and Linda Tiltman, were left without their only child. The town of Greenhithe was in shock. Police launched one of the largest investigations Kent had ever seen. Over the following 2 decades, officers took more than 1,700 statements, studied over 2,500 messages, and examined 1,000 pieces of physical evidence. 7 different suspects were questioned. None were charged. The case stayed open. Claire's parents kept it in the public eye for years, making appeals, speaking to journalists, refusing to let her name be forgotten. Both Cliff and Linda died before they ever got to see justice for their daughter. Among the people who lived in the area at the time was a local milkman named Colin Ash-Smith. He was 25 years old in January 1993. He lived in Swanscombe, just a short distance from Greenhithe. His parents, Aubrey and Diane Ash-Smith, were well known in the local community. Aubrey was a Labour Party councillor. Diane was also a councillor and would later become mayor of Swanscombe. The Ash-Smith family and the Tiltman family both attended the same Swanscombe and Greenhithe Royal British Legion Club. They knew each other. The day after Claire was harmed, Ash-Smith contacted police. He told them he had been driving through the area on the evening of January 18th and had seen someone with curly hair near a pedestrian crossing close to where Claire was found. It sounded like a helpful tip from a local resident. What it actually was, investigators would later conclude, was a calculated move to explain why his car might have been spotted in the area that night. He was building himself an alibi before anyone had even looked at him. Then he attended Claire's funeral. He stood among the mourners. He wore a beige jacket. Several witnesses recalled that jacket clearly. It was the same jacket, investigators later concluded, that he had been wearing on the night Claire was harmed. Witnesses who had seen a man near the scene that night described someone in a light-coloured, waist-length coat. Ash-Smith owned exactly that jacket. His then-girlfriend confirmed he wore it constantly. He wore it to say goodbye to the girl he had taken from her family. In October 1995, more than 2 years after Claire's passing, Ash-Smith attacked another woman. He harmed Charlotte Barnard, a 21-year-old, in Greenhithe. She was harmed 14 times, but survived. When police arrested him hours later and searched his white Ford Capri, they found evidence connecting him to a separate attack on a woman in Swanscombe in 1988. He was convicted and received life sentences for both attacks. He was jailed in 1996. Kent police kept Claire's case open throughout those years. The similarities between the 1993 attack on Claire and Ash-Smith's other crimes were clear. The location, the approach, the type of target. Officers refused to let it go. In 2010, the Kent Police Cold Case Unit received Home Office funding to re-examine the evidence using modern methods. 3 years later, in September 2013, police raided the Ash Smith family home. The breakthrough came from inside a prison. While Ash Smith was serving his sentences at HMP Wakefield, he had befriended a fellow inmate named Stéphane Dubois. He told Dubois that he had once seen someone on a zebra crossing and snapped. Dubois understood immediately what he was describing. He reported what he had heard to prison authorities. The information made its way to Kent Police. On the same day Ash Smith was due before the parole board to be considered for release, he was formally charged with the murder of Claire Tiltman. The timing was not a coincidence. Investigators had spent years building the case and moved the moment they were ready. The trial took place at Inner London Crown Court in late 2014. Prosecutors described the attack as a killing carried out by a ruthless and predatory individual, someone who targeted Claire rapidly and violently, giving her no time to escape. The jury heard about his pattern of attacks on women in the same area, his habit of going on what he himself called midnight walks while carrying blades, and the jacket he wore to Claire's funeral. After 5 weeks of evidence, the jury took just 3 hours to reach a verdict. On December 11, 2014, Colin Ash Smith was found guilty of the murder of Claire Tiltman. He was 46 years old. The judge sentenced him to life, with a minimum of 21 years before he could be considered for parole. Added to the life sentences he was already serving, he would spend the rest of his life behind bars. Claire's parents never heard that verdict. Cliff and Linda Tiltman both passed away in the years before the trial. The friends who had campaigned for Claire, organising candlelit walks and keeping her name alive for 2 decades, were in court every single day carrying her photograph. In April 2016, Dartford Borough Council renamed a local road Tiltman Avenue in her memory. A community centre in Stone was later named the Claire Tiltman Centre. Colin Ash Smith is currently held at HMP Durham. He will not be eligible for parole consideration until he has served the full minimum term. In 2016, when his father Aubrey passed away, Ash Smith applied for a temporary release licence to attend the funeral. The application was met with public outrage. He was denied. A floral tribute spelling the word Dad arrived at the crematorium in his name instead. The family that had shielded him, the parents who gave him a false alibi and destroyed evidence to protect him, were gone. And the girl he harmed on a January evening in 1993, 4 days after her 16th birthday, had a road named after her in the town where she grew up. The next case involves a man who did not just attend 1 funeral, he attended 5. And unlike Ash Smith, who at least kept his distance in a crowd, this next killer stood at the graveside of an entire family he had wiped out himself, weeping for the cameras, while quietly planning what to do with the inheritance. Section 2. Jeremy Bamber and the White House Farm Murders. On the night of August 6, 1985, 5 members of the same family were shot dead inside their farmhouse in the village of Tolleshunt Darcy in Essex. The victims were Neville Bamber, 61, a farmer and former RAF pilot, his wife June, also 61, a church warden, their daughter Sheila Caffell, 28, a model, and Sheila's 2 6-year-old twin boys, Daniel and Nicholas. 25 shots were fired inside that house. The youngest victims were found in their beds. The person who called the police that night was Jeremy Bamber, the family's adopted son. He told officers his father had phoned him to say Sheila had gone berserk with a rifle. When police arrived at White House Farm, they found the scene exactly as Bamber had described it. Sheila was found with the rifle. She had a history of mental illness. Police concluded she had harmed her family before turning the weapon on herself. The case was closed as a murder followed by a self-inflicted passing. Jeremy Bamber was treated as a grieving son. 9 days after the passing of his entire family, Bamber attended the funerals. He stood at the graveside of his parents, his sister, and his 2 young nephews. Cameras were there. Photographs were taken. In the images that were published, Bamber appeared overcome with grief, clutching the hand of his girlfriend, Julie Mugford, tears on his face. The press treated him as a young man crushed by unimaginable loss. What was happening behind that performance was something else entirely. Relatives who were present at the funeral said that the moment the cameras stopped rolling, Bamber's behaviour changed. Colin Caffell, Sheila's former husband and the father of the twin boys, later said that Bamber began making jokes during the journey to the crematorium and spoke about getting back to the house with Julie to have some fun. One account noted that Bamber's stated concern at the funeral was making sure the cameras captured his best angle. In the days and weeks that followed, Bamber began selling his family's possessions almost immediately. He put adverts in the paper to sell his father's car. He tried to sell his mother's car to Julie Mugford's mother. He attempted to sell photographs of his sister to a national newspaper for a reported sum of £20,000. The paper declined. He took holidays in Amsterdam. He dined at expensive restaurants. He had the family's beloved dog put to sleep. He stood to inherit an estate worth close to £500,000. Julie Mugford had been with Bamber through all of it. She had provided his alibi. She had stood beside him at the funerals. But as the weeks passed, she went to police. She told them that before the passing of his family, Bamber had spoken repeatedly about wanting them gone. He had talked about arson. He had talked about hiring someone to harm his father. He had described his parents as burdens and his sister as beyond help. Mugford told police that on the night of the incident, Bamber had called her and told her something terrible had happened, before police had even been officially informed. Forensic investigators then made a discovery that changed everything. A silencer belonging to the rifle was found in a cupboard downstairs. Testing revealed a bloodstain inside it that matched Sheila's blood type. Pathologists concluded that Sheila's arms were not long enough to have held the rifle against herself with the silencer attached and pressed the trigger. If the silencer had been on the gun when the final shot was fired, Sheila could not have done it herself. That meant someone else had been in the house that night. Jeremy Bamber was arrested 9 weeks after the passing of his family. He was charged with 5 counts of unlawful taking of life. His trial began in October 1986 at Chelmsford Crown Court. Mugford was the star witness, telling the court everything Bamber had said in the months leading up to August 1985. The jury deliberated and returned a majority verdict of 10-2, guilty on all 5 counts. The judge, Justice Drake, described Bamber as evil, almost beyond belief, and sentenced him to 5 life terms. The minimum recommended term was 25 years, which was later changed to a whole life order, meaning Jeremy Bamber will never be released. He has appealed his conviction multiple times. Every appeal has failed. He maintains his innocence from prison, where he has been held for nearly 4 decades. The estate he harmed his family to inherit was never his. He was cut out of his grandmother's will following his conviction. __quote_0___. The next case is different in one striking way. Unlike Bamber, who performed grief for cameras and then dropped the act the moment they stopped rolling, the next person on this list did not even bother pretending at the funeral. She stood outside the house of the family she had destroyed and laughed. Section 3. Mary Bell and the Scotswood Stranglings. The summer of 1968 in Scotswood, Newcastle, was warm and long. It was the kind of neighbourhood where children played outside until dark, running between streets and patches of wasteland without much adult supervision. Nobody locked their doors. Nobody worried about the kids. And then 2 young boys turned up dead, and the person responsible turned out to be one of the children playing among them. Martin Brown was 4 years old when his body was found on May 25, 1968, inside an abandoned house on St Margaret's Road. There were no obvious signs of struggle. Police initially treated his passing as a tragic accident. No crime scene was preserved. People walked through the house before any proper examination took place. A few days later, 2 handwritten notes were found at a nearby nursery that had been broken into and vandalised. The notes confessed to Martin's passing. Police assumed they were the work of children playing a sick prank and did not pursue them seriously. Then, on July 31, 1968, 3-year-old Brian Howe went missing from White House Road. His family searched the streets. Neighbours helped. Late that night, police found Brian's body on a patch of wasteland local children called the Tin Lizzie. He had been strangled. There were additional marks on his body that made clear this was deliberate. This time, there was no question. Someone had taken the life of a toddler. 2 girls came under suspicion almost immediately. Mary Bell, who had just turned 11, and her friend Norma Bell, who was 13. They were not related. Officers noticed that both girls showed unusual interest in the investigations. They asked odd questions. They inserted themselves into conversations about the passing of boys they claimed to be upset about. Mary, in particular, stood out to detectives. She was described as intelligent, quick, and unsettling. She could anticipate the next question before it was asked and had an answer ready. Detectives brought both girls in for questioning multiple times. Mary's stories kept shifting. During one interview, she told police she had seen an older boy with a pair of broken scissors on the day Brian was harmed. That detail was a serious mistake. The fact that scissors had been used on Brian's body had never been released to the public. Only investigators knew. And now, Mary Bell had just described them. On August 7, 1968, Brian Howe was buried at a local cemetery. More than 200 people attended. Detective Chief Inspector James Dobson of Newcastle Police was also there, watching. He had been watching Mary Bell throughout the investigation and had decided that day would be the day he moved. What he saw at the funeral confirmed everything. As Brian Howe's coffin was brought out from the family home at the start of the funeral procession, Mary Bell was standing directly outside the house. Dobson watched her. She stood there, laughing and rubbing her hands together. Dobson later described the moment in his own words. She stood there, laughing and rubbing her hands, and he thought, "My God, I have got to bring her in. She will do another one." Both girls were formally charged with the taking of Brian Howe's life that same evening, August 7th, 1968. Mary's response when she was charged was recorded. She said, "That is all right by me." She was 11 years old. The trial began at Newcastle Assizes on December 5, 1968. Both girls sat in court in cotton dresses and white socks. Norma broke down in tears regularly throughout the proceedings. Mary remained largely detached, watching the lawyers and the jury with what observers described as calm curiosity. Psychiatrists who examined Mary concluded she displayed classic signs of psychopathic disorder. The court heard evidence that tied both girls to both boys. Fibre evidence, the confession notes, the scissors detail. Norma's full statement, in which she described Mary carrying out the stranglings. On December 17, 1968, the verdicts were delivered. Norma Bell was acquitted of all charges. Mary Bell was convicted of the manslaughter of both Martin Brown and Brian Howe, with the jury accepting the defence argument of diminished responsibility, given her age and psychological state. The judge described her as dangerous and said she posed a very grave risk to other children. She was sentenced to be detained at Her Majesty's pleasure, an indefinite sentence for a juvenile. Mary Bell was released from custody in 1980 at the age of 23. In 2003, the High Court granted her lifelong anonymity. Her current identity and location remain protected by law to this day. The next case moves from the streets of Newcastle to the surgery of a trusted family doctor, a man whose patients adored him, whose waiting list was a year long, and who used that trust to end more than 200 lives while attending their funerals as a concerned and caring physician. Section 4. Harold Shipman and the Hyde Patients. In the town of Hyde, just outside Manchester, Harold Shipman was the kind of doctor people felt lucky to have. His waiting list was a year long. Patients described being accepted onto his list as feeling like winning the lottery. He made house calls. He remembered names. He sat with families. He was calm, reliable, and respected. Receptionists at a nearby practice had a nickname for him. They called him Dr. Death. But nobody outside that surgery took it seriously. Not for a very long time. Harold Frederick Shipman was born in Nottingham in 1946. He studied medicine at Leeds School of Medicine and qualified as a doctor in 1970. His career had one early blemish. In 1975, while working at a practice in Todmorden, West Yorkshire, he was caught forging prescriptions for pethidine, a strong painkiller, for his own personal use. He was fined and briefly attended a rehabilitation clinic. He was allowed to continue practicing medicine. By 1977, he had moved to Hyde and joined a medical practice there. By 1993, he had set up his own solo surgery on Market Street. What was happening inside that surgery, and inside the homes of his patients, was something nobody wanted to believe was possible. Shipman was taking the lives of his own patients using lethal injections of diamorphine, which is a medical-grade form of heroin. He would visit a patient at home or invite them to his surgery. He would administer the injection, he would wait, then he would inform the family that their loved one had passed from natural causes, sign the death certificate himself, and in many cases recommend cremation. He attended the funerals of people he had taken. He consoled families at gravesides. He helped arrange services. He inserted himself into the grief of the very people he had created. His victims were overwhelmingly elderly women, people who trusted him completely. People whose families, when they called him after finding their mother or grandmother unresponsive in a chair, were grateful he arrived so quickly and was so composed. He visited some victims alone, meaning there were no witnesses. He then altered their medical records on his computer, adding fictional symptoms to make the passing look medically expected. Phone records later showed that in some cases, he pretended to call emergency services in front of relatives while the line was dead. Concerns were raised over the years by multiple people. A local undertaker noticed an unusual pattern in the number of patients dying under Shipman's care and raised it directly with the doctor. Shipman dismissed him. A nearby GP, named Dr. Linda Reynolds, became so concerned about the number of deaths among his patients that she contacted the local coroner in 1998. An initial police investigation found nothing. Shipman was not charged. The case broke open because of one patient's daughter. Kathleen Grundy was 81 years old, active, healthy, and well-liked in Hyde. She passed away on June 24, 1998, shortly after a visit from Shipman. Her daughter, Angela Woodruff, was a solicitor. When a typewritten will appeared that left Grundy's entire estate, valued at around £400,000 to Shipman, Woodruff knew immediately something was wrong. The signature did not match her mother's handwriting. She went to police. Grundy's body was exhumed. Testing found lethal levels of diamorphine in her system. Shipman was arrested on September 7, 1998. The investigation that followed was enormous. Police examined hundreds of deaths connected to Shipman going back decades. On January 31, 2000, Shipman was convicted of murdering 15 of his patients and sentenced to 15 life terms with a whole life order, meaning he would never be released. The judge recommended he never be considered for parole. A public inquiry, chaired by Dame Janet Smith, then examined 888 patient deaths across Shipman's entire career. The inquiry concluded in 2002 that Shipman had almost certainly taken the lives of at least 215 patients. A later report raised that figure to a possible 250, dating back as far as 1971. The exact number will never be known. Most of the evidence was destroyed because Shipman had recommended cremation in the majority of cases. Harold Shipman was found in his cell at HMP Wakefield on January 13, 2004, the day before his 58th birthday. He had taken his own life. He left no confession and no explanation. His crimes led directly to major changes in how the United Kingdom certifies passing, monitors controlled substances, and oversees medical professionals. The forms used to authorise cremation in England and Wales were rewritten specifically because of him. __quote _1__. The next case on this list also involves someone who stood among grieving people while hiding the truth, but this time in a far more public setting, in front of news cameras, appealing to the nation to help find a person they had already harmed themselves. Section 5. Ian Huntley and the Soham murders. On the evening of August 4th, 2002, two 10-year-old girls left a family barbecue in Soham, Cambridgeshire, to walk to a nearby leisure centre to buy sweets. Holly Wells and Jessica Chapman had been best friends since they were 4 years old. They were wearing matching Manchester United football shirts. They left Holly's house at around 6:15 in the evening. Holly's mother went to check on them at 8 p.m. and found them gone. Their parents reported them missing to police at 9:55 that night. What followed was one of the largest missing persons investigations in British history. Thousands of volunteers joined the search. The story dominated national news for nearly 2 weeks. Across the country, people followed every update, hoping for good news. One of the first people police spoke to was Ian Huntley, a 28-year-old who worked as a caretaker at Soham Village College, the local secondary school. Huntley told investigators he had seen the girls on his doorstep on the evening they disappeared. They had knocked to ask whether his girlfriend, Maxine Carr, who was a teaching assistant at the girls' primary school and someone the girls knew well, had been successful in a recent job application. Huntley said he told them she had not got the position, and the girls left. He claimed that was the last time he saw them. Huntley made himself very visible throughout the investigation. He gave television interviews from outside his home on College Road. He appeared composed and cooperative. During one press conference where the girls' parents made an emotional appeal, Huntley was present. He turned to Holly's father, Kevin Wells, and said, "Kevin, I am so sorry. I did not realise it was your daughter." In another interview with a journalist, when asked whether the girls would get into a car with a stranger, Huntley interrupted before Maxine Carr could answer. He said he thought Holly might, but that Jessica would put up a fight. The journalist noted immediately how strange it was that a school caretaker who barely knew the girls could make that distinction. Maxine Carr, meanwhile, was telling police that she and Huntley had been at home together on the evening of August 4th. She was lying. Phone records and witness accounts later placed her in Grimsby that night. On August 17th, 2002, 13 days after the girls disappeared, a gamekeeper discovered 2 bodies in a ditch near RAF Lakenheath in Suffolk, approximately 40 miles from Soham. The remains were found side by side. They were later confirmed to be Holly Wells and Jessica Chapman. Both had been burned in an attempt to destroy evidence. Pathologists determined the most likely cause of passing was suffocation. Police had already been closing in on Huntley. Fibre evidence from clothing the girls had been wearing was found inside his house and car. In a storage building at Soham Village College, an officer found a bin containing the partially burned remains of the Manchester United shirts the girls had been photographed in on the night they vanished, along with their shoes. Huntley was arrested on August 17th, the same day the bodies were discovered. Maxine Carr was arrested on the same day. The trial began at the Old Bailey in London in November 2003. Huntley pleaded not guilty. He claimed the girls had come into his house and that Holly had suffered a nosebleed while inside. He said Jessica had fallen into the bath accidentally and that Holly had been overcome by shock. He maintained he had panicked and that their passing had not been deliberate. The prosecution presented forensic evidence, digital evidence, and the physical evidence recovered from his workplace. Maxine Carr was tried separately. She had not been present during the passing of the girls and had no knowledge of what Huntley had done, but she had lied to police to give him an alibi. On December 17, 2003, Ian Huntley was found guilty of the unlawful taking of life of both Holly Wells and Jessica Chapman. He was sentenced to 2 terms of life imprisonment. The High Court later set a minimum term of 40 years before he could be considered for parole, meaning he would not be eligible until 2042 at the earliest. Maxine Carr was convicted of conspiring to pervert the course of justice and received a 3.5-year sentence. The Huntley case led directly to major changes in how the United Kingdom vets people who work with children. The Bouchard inquiry, which reported in 2004, found that multiple police forces had failed to share information about previous complaints against Huntley. This led to the creation of the Disclosure and Barring Service, which now screens anyone seeking to work with vulnerable people. Ian Huntley passed away in March 2026 after sustaining serious injuries during an attack by another inmate at HMP Frankland. He was cremated without ceremony. The next case involves someone who did not just show up at a funeral, but sat in a police press conference holding the hand of the victim's own mother while appealing to the public to find a person she herself had already taken from the world. Section 6. Tracy Andrews and the murder of Lee Harvey. Lee Harvey was 25 years old. He was a bus driver from Alvechurch in Worcestershire. By the autumn of 1996, he had been in a relationship with Tracy Andrews for 2 years. They lived together in a flat called the Becks. People who knew them described the relationship as volatile. Both families had expressed concern. Police had been called to the address before. In late October 1996, just 5 weeks before Lee's passing, officers attended after an incident in which Andrews had bitten Lee on the neck. His mother, Maureen, had begged him to end the relationship. He did not. On the evening of Sunday, December 1st, 1996, the couple had spent the day arguing. They went to a local pub in Bromsgrove in an attempt to smooth things over. On the drive back to their flat, the argument started again. Lee pulled the car over on a country lane called Cooper's Hill in Alvechurch. A man named Richard Main, who was visiting a friend nearby, heard a commotion outside. He walked toward the sound and found Lee Harvey on the ground by the side of the road, covered in blood, and Tracy Andrews standing over him, also covered in blood, calling for help. Richard ran to call emergency services. By the time they arrived, Lee Harvey was dead. He had been harmed more than 30 times with a penknife. His carotid artery had been severed. Andrews was taken to hospital and treated for her own injuries, which included 2 black eyes and bruising. 3 days later, on December 3rd, 1996, she appeared at a nationally televised police press conference. She sat beside Lee's mother Maureen and his family. She held their hands. She wept. She described being followed on the road by a blue Ford Sierra containing 2 men. She said the passenger had got out, attacked Lee, and driven off. She described the attacker as very overweight, with staring eyes. She directly appealed to the driver of the Sierra, telling him that whoever his passenger was had ruined her life, and the lives of Lee's family, and asking him to come forward. The press conference was broadcast across the country. Andrews became the face of the story. Newspapers carried photographs of her alongside tributes to Lee. Public sympathy was enormous. Then Lee Harvey was buried. Andrews attended his funeral. She stood among his grieving family, the same family she had been photographed comforting at the press conference. She was present as the people who loved Lee said goodbye to him, knowing the entire time that she was the one who had taken him from them. Behind the scenes, the police investigation was already pointing in a different direction. A child who lived on Cooper's Hill told investigators she had heard the argument that night. She could not see who was involved, but she could tell that one voice was male and one was distinctly female. No sightings of a blue Ford Sierra were ever reported, despite a major public appeal. Investigators could find no evidence that any such vehicle had been in the area. The physical evidence began to build. Andrews had spent long periods alone in the hospital bathroom on the night of Lee's passing. Police believed she had used that time to dispose of the penknife. When officers examined the boots Andrews had been wearing, they found a mark inside one of them, consistent with the shape of a penknife blade, along with traces of blood. It was their conclusion that she had concealed the weapon in her boot and got rid of it at the hospital. Andrews attempted to take her own life the day after the press conference by taking an overdose. She was still in hospital 2 days later when police first arrested and questioned her. She was discharged and then formally charged with the unlawful taking of Lee Harvey's life on December 19, 1996. She was released on bail. The trial took place at Birmingham Crown Court in July 1997. Andrews denied the charge throughout. After a month-long trial, the jury found her guilty on July 29, 1997. Mr. Justice Buckley sentenced her to life in prison with a recommended minimum of 14 years. Her appeal against the conviction was rejected in October 1998. In April 1999, while in prison, Andrews finally admitted that she had harmed Lee Harvey. She claimed she had lost control during an argument and that Lee had been the one to produce the penknife first. She was released from prison in 2011 after serving 14 years. She changed her name, altered her appearance, and began a new life at a location that has never been made public. Lee Harvey's mother, Maureen, later wrote a book about losing her son and about the woman who had held her hand at that press conference while knowing exactly what she had done. The next case also involves someone who performed grief in public while hiding the truth, but this person went even further, showing up not just at the funeral, but moving into the victim's own home and living with the family for months afterwards. Section 7. Stuart Hazel and the murder of Tia Sharp. Tia Sharp was 12 years old. She was described by everyone who knew her as confident, funny, and full of energy. When she walked into a room, people noticed. She had a close relationship with her grandmother, Christine Bicknell, who lived in a house on the Lindens in New Addington, a housing estate on the outskirts of South London. Tia visited regularly and felt completely at home there. Christine's partner, Stuart Hazel, had been part of the family's life for years. Tia's own mother, Natalie, described him as good with kids and good around the house. Tia looked up to him. Nobody had any reason to think otherwise. On the evening of August 2nd, 2012, Tia stayed the night at her grandmother's house while Christine was out at work. She and Hazel were alone in the house. By the early hours of August 3rd, Tia was dead. Hazel hid her body in the loft. He wrapped her in bin bags and pushed her into the eaves of the roof space, 12 feet above the ground floor of the house where her family would soon gather. Then he went about his day. When Christine returned home, Hazel told her Tia had left the house around midday to go to Croydon to buy shoes. When Tia did not come home that evening, the family raised the alarm. Police were contacted at around 6 p.m. on August 3rd. A search began immediately. 80 officers were eventually assigned to the case. More than 800 hours of CCTV footage were collected. Over 300 calls came into the incident room. 55 separate sightings of Tia were reported by members of the public and followed up. None checked out. The community of New Addington rallied completely. Up to 100 local residents came together to physically search for the 12-year-old girl, handing out leaflets, walking streets, looking everywhere they could think of. Stuart Hazel joined them. He walked among the volunteers. He helped hand out leaflets. He searched for a girl he already knew was dead, lying in a bag directly above where they were all standing. Police searched the house at the Lindens multiple times in the days that followed. On August 4th and 5th, officers made checks of the loft but did not locate the body. On a subsequent visit, a search dog gave an indication of something in the house. Officers noted it but took no further action after Hazel continued to insist Tia had walked out alive. He told police she had gone to Croydon. He told them she had been fine when she left. He told them the same story over and over, and for several days it held. On August 9th, 6 days after Tia went missing, Hazel gave a nationally televised interview to ITV News. He sat in front of cameras and described Tia as a happy-go-lucky golden angel. He said he loved her to bits and that she was like his own daughter. He made an emotional appeal for her to come home safely. He told the journalist he had nothing to do with her disappearance. Body language analysts who later reviewed the footage noted that his responses were inconsistent with someone genuinely concerned, describing his behaviour as animated and overly constructed, as if he was performing rather than speaking from grief. But in the moment, many who watched believed him. He was, to anyone watching, a distraught family member, desperate for news. His phone told a different story. Records recovered later showed that while Tia's body lay decomposing in his loft during those same days, Hazel had been searching online for content completely at odds with the public image he was projecting. He also kept Tia's evening meal sitting in the oven, a show of hope he maintained for the cameras and the family for when she came home. On August 10th, a week after Tia went missing, 2 police family liaison officers attending the address noticed a strong smell. A forensic team was called. They followed it to the loft. Inside, wrapped in black bin bags and pushed to the side of the eaves, was the body of Tia Sharp. It had been there throughout the entire search, throughout the community leaflet drops, throughout the TV interview, throughout every police visit. Hazel was arrested that same evening at Cannon Hill Common in Morden after a tip-off from a member of the public. 2 memory cards were later recovered from the property, hidden in different locations, including inside a door frame on the ground floor. The cards contained images and videos that proved Hazel had harboured a deeply disturbing interest in Tia long before the night of August 2nd. Hazel was charged with Tia's unlawful taking of life on August 12, 2012. He was held on remand at Belmarsh Prison. He pleaded not guilty and a trial was set. When the trial began at the Old Bailey in May 2013, graphic evidence was presented to the jury over 4 days. On the 5th day, May 13th, Hazel changed his plea to guilty. His barrister told the court that Tia's family had suffered enough and that his client did not want to put them through any more. Tia's father, Stephen Carter, sitting in the public gallery, broke down in tears. On May 14, 2013, Mr. Justice Nichol sentenced Stuart Hazel to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 38 years. He will be 75 years old before he is eligible to be considered for parole. The sentencing judge noted the concealment of Tia's body, the deception of her family, and the anguish caused to everyone who searched for her while she was already gone. Tia Sharp was privately cremated on September 14, 2012. She was 12 years old. The house on the Lindens was demolished in June 2013. New houses were built on the site. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Section 8. Nat Fraser and the murder of Arlene Fraser. On the morning of April 28, 1998, Arlene Fraser waved her 2 children off to school from the family home at 2 Smith Street in New Elgin, a town in Moray in the northeast of Scotland. Her son Jamie was 10 years old. Her daughter Natalie was 5. That wave was the last time anyone saw Arlene Fraser alive. She was 33 years old. She had been trying to leave her marriage. In the months before she disappeared, Arlene had been attending college to build financial independence. She had been working with a solicitor on divorce plans. She even had an appointment booked with that solicitor on the very day she vanished, an appointment she never kept. On the morning of April 28th, she called her son's primary school at 9:41 to ask about a school trip. When a staff member tried to call her back minutes later, there was no answer. A friend arrived at the house around 11 that morning for a lunch date and found it empty. The vacuum cleaner was still plugged in. Arlene's glasses, contact lenses, medication, keys and passport were all exactly where she had left them. She had simply gone. Her estranged husband was Nathaniel Fraser, known as Nat. He was a local fishmonger and fruiterer in Elgin. At the time Arlene disappeared, Nat was on bail for the attempted taking of her life, an incident just weeks earlier in which he had throttled her so severely that Grampian police had taken the unusual step of having her examined by a pathologist. Her eyes had been bloodshot. 10 more seconds, authorities concluded, and she would have been gone then. Despite this, Nat Fraser had a solid alibi for the morning of April 28th. He had been carrying out deliveries with an employee. Police could not place him at the scene. What followed was one of the most extensive missing persons investigations ever mounted in Scotland. Mountain rescue teams, police dogs, RAF aircraft and civilian volunteers searched the area around Elgin. More than 1,000 statements were taken. Police launched public appeals. A £20,000 reward was posted, £10,000 from Nat Fraser himself and £10,000 from Arlene's own family. And Nat Fraser stood in front of television cameras and played the role of a husband desperate to find his missing wife. He gave a nationally televised press conference appealing for information about Arlene's whereabouts. He urged her to come home. He later appeared on a BBC programme, and when asked directly whether he believed Arlene was still alive, he looked into the camera and said he lived in hope. The public believed him. Some people accused police of hounding him There was genuine resistance in parts of the community to the idea that the man making public appeals and posting rewards could be responsible for his wife's disappearance. Behind all of it, investigators slowly built a different picture. A close associate of Nat, a pig farmer named Hector Dick, who had been best man at Nat and Arlene's wedding in 1987, had purchased a beige Ford Fiesta in Elgin on the night before Arlene went missing. The car was later traced, then destroyed, then connected through witness statements to the transportation of Arlene's body. It was eventually established that Nat Fraser had organised and paid for his wife to be taken from the world, using associates to carry out what he had planned. Her body has never been found. The prosecution's case against Fraser was built entirely on circumstantial evidence: phone records, witness accounts, and the movements of the Fiesta. In January 2003, 5 years after Arlene's disappearance, Nat Fraser stood trial at the High Court in Edinburgh. The charges against 2 co-accused were dropped during proceedings, and both men became prosecution witnesses. On January 29, 2003, Nat Fraser was found guilty of the unlawful taking of life of Arlene Fraser and was sentenced to a minimum of 25 years in prison. The case did not end there. Fraser appealed. In 2008, the appeal court rejected his first bid. He applied again, and in 2011, the UK Supreme Court quashed his conviction on the grounds that crucial evidence about Arlene's jewellery had not been disclosed to the defence before the original trial, meaning Fraser had not received a fair hearing. He was released on bail. Arlene's family described the decision as bitterly disappointing. A retrial was held in 2012 at the High Court in Edinburgh. The same evidence was presented. The same witnesses gave evidence. The jury returned the same verdict. Nat Fraser was found guilty for the second time of the unlawful taking of life of Arlene Fraser. The judge described the crime as shocking and wicked. Fraser was sentenced to life with a minimum term of 17 years before he could be considered for parole. He will not be eligible until 2030 at the earliest. Arlene's body has never been recovered. Her family has campaigned for years to change Scottish law so that killers who refuse to reveal the location of their victims' remains can be prevented from being released on parole. Arlene's sister Carol Gillies has spoken publicly about the family's inability to say a proper goodbye, the absence of a grave, the absence of any place to go. Their father, Hector, died without ever knowing where his daughter was. Arlene's own children, Jamie and Natalie, were 10 and 5 years old when they waved goodbye to their mother at the school gate that April morning and never saw her again. The man who had organised her taking of life stood at a press conference weeks later and posted a reward for information about where she had gone. He looked into television cameras and said he lived in hope that she was still alive. He knew exactly what had happened. He knew there was no body to find. And he kept saying it, for months, while the search teams walked the hills around Elgin and Arlene's family waited for news that would never come. The next case involves a man whose method of hiding what he had done was not to attend one service or give one interview, but to repeat the act so many times over so many years that the families of his victims never once imagined the trusted figure standing at their gravesides could be responsible for putting them there. Section 9. Christopher Halliwell and the murder of Sian O'Callaghan. Sian O'Callaghan was 22 years old. She worked as an office administrator and lived in Swindon, Wiltshire, with her boyfriend, Kevin Reap. On the evening of Saturday, March 19, 2011, she went on a night out with friends at a nightclub called Suju on the High Street. At 2:52 in the morning, CCTV cameras captured her leaving the club to walk the 800 metres home. It was a short distance. She had done it before. She never arrived. When Kevin woke the next morning and Sian was not there, he sent her a text. By that point, her phone had already moved 12 miles outside of Swindon. Its signal picked up near Savernake Forest. Kevin contacted police at 9:45 that morning. Within hours, one of the largest missing person investigations in Wiltshire's history was underway. On March 20th, officers launched a public appeal. 2 days later, on March 22nd, around 400 volunteers gathered to physically search Savernake Forest, the area where Sian's phone signal had last been detected. An anonymous donor offered a reward of £20,000 for information leading to her safe return. Her family made a public appeal on March 21st, standing in front of cameras and pleading for anyone with information to come forward. Sian's face was across every news broadcast in the country. Throughout all of it, Christopher Halliwell knew exactly where she was. Halliwell was 47 years old and worked as a taxi driver in Swindon. On the night of March 19th, he had driven his green Toyota Avensis to the area near Suju nightclub. CCTV footage reviewed by police showed his cab pulling up alongside Sian as she walked home in the early hours. She got in. He drove her away from Swindon into the countryside and took her life, before burying her in a shallow grave near Uffington in Oxfordshire, approximately 12 miles from where he had picked her up. In the days that followed, as volunteers scoured Savernake Forest and Sian's family waited by their phones, Halliwell went about his life in Swindon. He continued to drive his taxi. He was among the community that was searching and grieving. Police placed him under surveillance after CCTV analysis identified his vehicle. Officers watched him. During this period, they observed him visiting the area of Savernake Forest on multiple occasions, returning to where Sian had been. They also saw him purchase a large quantity of painkillers at a supermarket, which led Detective Superintendent Steve Fulcher, the senior investigating officer, to conclude that Halliwell might be preparing to take his own life, and that the chance to find Sian would be lost. On March 24th, 6 days after Sian went missing, officers arrested Halliwell at the Asda supermarket in North Swindon as he got into his car. He was arrested on suspicion of kidnapping. He was cautioned and told he had the right to remain silent. He refused to cooperate and said he wanted a solicitor. What happened next became one of the most controversial decisions in recent British policing history. Detective Superintendent Fulcher, believing Sian might still be alive and that standard procedures would cost her her life, ordered Halliwell taken to Barbury Castle, an Iron Age hill fort south of Swindon, rather than to a police station. There, standing on open ground, Fulcher spoke to Halliwell man to man. He offered him cigarettes. He told him there was a chance Sian was still alive. After a long silence, Halliwell agreed to cooperate. He led police to a site near Uffington. Sian's body was found there the same day, March 24th, 2011, in a shallow grave. She had been taken in the early hours of March 19th. Her boyfriend had reported her missing that same morning, and she had been lying in the ground the entire time volunteers were walking through Savernake Forest, calling her name. As Halliwell was being driven back toward the police station following the discovery, he asked to speak with Fulcher again. He told him, "Do you want another one?" He then led officers to a field near Eastleach in Gloucestershire, where he counted out his steps and stopped at a spot in the earth. Buried there were the remains of Becky Godden Edwards, a 20-year-old woman from Swindon who had gone missing in 2003 and had never been found. Halliwell had taken her life 8 years earlier, and nobody had known. The legal proceedings that followed were complex. A judge ruled that Fulcher's decision to question Halliwell without following proper arrest guidelines meant the confessions were not admissible as evidence. The charge relating to Becky was initially dropped. Halliwell pleaded guilty to Sian's unlawful taking of life on October 19, 2012, at Bristol Crown Court, and was sentenced to life in prison, with a minimum term of 25 years. It took until September 2016, with a separate trial built entirely on circumstantial evidence, for him to be convicted of Becky Godden Edwards' taking of life. He was then handed a whole life order, meaning he will never leave prison. Sian O'Callaghan's funeral was held at Kingsdown Crematorium on April 18, 2011. Halliwell was in custody by then. He did not attend. But for 6 days, while Sian's family made television appeals and hundreds of strangers walked through cold forest calling her name, he was among them in that community, knowing the truth and saying nothing. In Swindon, a pond near the spot where Halliwell had buried Sian's shoes was searched after his arrest. Inside it, officers found a collection of around 60 items of women's clothing and accessories. Nobody knows how many other victims those items belong to. The full extent of what Christopher Halliwell did over the course of his life has never been established. The final case on this list involves a man who did not search alongside volunteers or give TV interviews. He did something in some ways even harder to comprehend. He sat across a desk from the colleagues and friends of the woman he had just taken, answered questions about her disappearance, expressed concern for her well-being, and then went home to his family for dinner. All on the same day he had ended her life. Section 10. David Gilroy and the murder of Suzanne Pilley. Suzanne Pilley was 38 years old. She was a bookkeeper who worked at a company called Infrastructure Managers Limited, based in Thistle Street in the centre of Edinburgh. She lived in Whitson Road, not far from the city centre, and by all accounts was a warm, sociable woman who was close to her family. On the morning of Tuesday, May 4th, 2010, at 8:36 in the morning, she sent her mother a cheerful text message about a new relationship she was hopeful about. She stopped at the Sainsbury's on the corner of St Andrew Square on her way to work. CCTV cameras picked her up turning onto Thistle Street at 8:54 in the morning, walking toward the entrance of her office building. She never made it to her desk. When Suzanne failed to appear at her workstation, colleagues grew concerned. It was completely out of character. At 12:45 in the afternoon, they contacted her family. Her parents reported her missing. Police were called. What followed was one of the most intensive missing person investigations Scotland had ever seen. Officers reviewed footage from more than 250 CCTV cameras across Edinburgh and the surrounding area. Screens were erected in the city centre showing footage of Suzanne's last known movements. A major public appeal went out. Hundreds of square miles of remote countryside in Argyll were searched by police, mountain rescue teams, military personnel, and specialist cadaver dogs. The investigation eventually expanded to cover a 400 square mile area, stretching from Tyndrum to Inverary. Among the people at work the day Suzanne disappeared was David Gilroy. He was 47 years old, married with 2 children, and had worked at the same company as Suzanne for years. The two had been in a relationship, an affair that Suzanne had recently ended. She had begun seeing someone new and had made clear to Gilroy that it was over. In the weeks before she disappeared, Gilroy had sent her more than 400 text messages. Those messages stopped the day she vanished. Prosecutors would later argue that on the morning of May 4th, Gilroy lured Suzanne to the basement storeroom of their shared office building, where he took her life. CCTV captured him entering and leaving the basement area of the building. Colleagues who interacted with him that day later described him as agitated, shaking, and visibly not himself. That same afternoon, he purchased 4 air fresheners, which investigators concluded was an attempt to mask a smell in his vehicle. He cleaned areas of the basement. He went about the working day. Then, that evening, David Gilroy went to a presentation at his daughter's school. He sat with his wife. He watched his child perform. He went out for a meal at a restaurant called Vittoria on Leith Walk. All of this happened on the same day that Suzanne Pilley's family were making desperate calls, trying to find out where she was. While police were beginning to log her as a missing person, Gilroy was sitting in a school hall, watching his daughter on stage. The following morning, May 5th, Gilroy told colleagues he had a site visit to attend at a school in Loch Gilphead, a town in Argyll, 130 miles from Edinburgh. He drove there, but police reconstructing his journey later identified significant gaps in his movements, periods of several hours on both the outward and return journey between Loch Gilphead and Inverary, where his whereabouts could not be accounted for. Investigators believed those gaps were when he disposed of Suzanne's body, somewhere in the remote Argyll countryside. Specialist vegetation found on his car indicated it had been driven off-road. The boot of his Vauxhall Vectra was identified as an area of interest by cadaver dogs during the subsequent search of his vehicle and workplace. Despite the scale of the search, Suzanne's body was never found. She has never been found. Her family was left without the ability to hold a proper funeral, without closure, without knowing where she is. Her father, Rob Pilley, passed away in February 2019, never having learned what happened to his daughter. David Gilroy was arrested on June 23, 2010, 7 weeks after Suzanne disappeared. He was charged with her unlawful taking of life and with attempting to defeat the ends of justice by concealing her body. He was released on bail twice during the lead-up to trial, maintaining throughout that he had nothing to do with her disappearance. The trial began at the High Court of Justiciary in Edinburgh on February 20th, 2012. It was a landmark case in Scottish legal history because the prosecution sought a conviction for taking a life without a body ever having been recovered. No forensic evidence from Suzanne's remains was presented. The case rested entirely on circumstantial evidence. The CCTV footage, the phone records, the cadaver dog responses, the vegetation on his car, his inconsistent statements, his suspicious behaviour on the day and the day after, the sudden stop in his 400 texts to Suzanne the moment she vanished, and the testimony of colleagues who described his demeanour that Tuesday morning. After deliberating for nearly 2 days, the jury returned a majority guilty verdict on March 15, 2012. David Gilroy was found guilty of the unlawful taking of life of Suzanne Pilley and of attempting to defeat the ends of justice. On April 18, 2012, Lord Brackadale sentenced him to life imprisonment with a minimum punishment term of 18 years. He will not be eligible for parole consideration until 2030. Gilroy has maintained his innocence ever since. He has never disclosed where Suzanne's body is. He has appealed his conviction multiple times. Every appeal has failed. In 2022, new Scottish parole rules were introduced that mean killers who refuse to disclose the location of their victims' remains can have that refusal taken into account when their parole is considered. Suzanne's sister, Gail Fairgrieve, has spoken publicly about the impact of not having her sister's body. She described the family as living in a state of limbo for over a decade, unable to say a proper goodbye, unable to visit a grave, unable to have the closure that even a funeral might bring. Every birthday, every Christmas, every family milestone has passed without Suzanne. Her niece and nephew have grown up without ever being able to grieve properly, because there is nowhere to go. David Gilroy sat among Suzanne's colleagues the day he took her from them. He went to a school performance that evening. He drove to Argyll the next morning, and for 7 weeks he returned to that office, to those same people, while they grieved and searched and wondered. The only person who knew exactly what had happened to Suzanne Pilley was sitting right there among them. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.